The standard narrative about the A-10 Warthog is that it's an unkillable tank with wings. We are told its titanium bathtub armor made the pilot immortal, and its iconic 30mm cannon made it the single greatest asset of close air support. This mainstream history is entirely wrong. We are going to go beneath the armored skin to expose the raw data, because the darkest tactical secret of the Cold War wasn't a weapon system, it was a doctrine. It was an operational calculus so bleak, so mathematical, that the High Command gave the pilots of the A-10 Warthog a name that suppressed military archives have only recently confirmed. They called them suicide armor. By looking at the classified logistics, we find that the entire concept of the Warthog was not engineered for endurance. It was engineered as a high-velocity, low-altitude expendable asset. The doctrine for a land war in Europe against thousands of Soviet tanks was defined by an impossible equation of survival. The Warthog was never meant to be a permanent asset of the air war. Its entire design philosophy was built around a singular, terminal data point. The A-10 was a flying bullet, meticulously engineered to solve a resources problem with sheer, suicidal mathematics. It was built to inflicting maximum attrition on a much larger force, regardless of the cost. The tactical reality was that the A-10 was never meant to survive the battlefield. It was merely meant to outperform the raw cost of its own wreckage. The High Command calculated exact loss ratios. If one Warthog could trade itself to destroy 15 T-72 tanks, the system was operational. To truly understand why the Air Force considered this platform suicide armor, we must dissect the hard, technical truth. The A-10 signature 30mm rotary cannon is not a gun. The jet is a flying structure built around the gun. That central system is a resource bottleneck. But while this gave the plane overwhelming firepower, the technical trade-off required the aircraft to operate at critically low speeds and altitudes directly inside the killing zones of modern anti-aircraft systems. To protect the pilot from this deliberate vulnerability, German, no, Soviet, engineers focused on deep integration. The A-10 has redundant flight controls, separating hydraulic and manual systems. It features redundant engines spaced widely apart, and most famously, it has a 700-pound titanium bathtub armor, casing designed to wrap the pilot in a layer of theoretical safety. Yet, this toughness was an illusion created by strategic necessity. The armor was never a defense, it was a trade. By late Cold War standards, the Warthog was considered technologically obsolete before its first deployment. Its analog targeting systems and slow maneuverability made it almost defenseless against modern radar-guided missile networks. This brings us directly into the deepest layer of the puzzle, the shadow logistics. While the High Command saw the A-10 as a terminal asset, the Air Force was forced to implement severe logistical constraints to keep them functional. The internal turret organization prioritized maximum loadout over continuous fire. Furthermore, the specialized internal radio frequencies allowing isolated crews to function as command nodes were missing. But the final calculated parameters of the suicide armor doctrine met the brutal reality of total industrial war when the Warthog actually saw combat. During the opening phases of the Gulf War, the A-10, the plane built for low-altitude warfare, was ordered to stay above 10,000 feet to avoid shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles. In the only scenario it was ever truly built for, its core doctrine was mathematically paralyzed. When the masterminds of destruction met the raw, unyielding physics of actual combat, masters of attrition became servants of necessity. The A-10 didn't just survive, it was forced to reinvent the physics of close air support while surrounded by anti-aircraft networks it was never supposed to defeat. The pilots didn't just fight to fly it because it was tough. They fought to fly it because the suicide armor was the only machine built to trade. But the most disturbing part of the entire A-10 story was not the aircraft itself. It was the casualty projections. During the peak Cold War years, NATO war simulations produced battlefield forecasts so catastrophic that entire categories of aircraft were evaluated using replacement mathematics instead of survival mathematics. Internal planning models assumed Soviet armored breakthroughs could pour through the Fulda Gap with such speed and density that conventional defensive lines would collapse within days. The only way to slow the advance was through relentless close air attrition. Aircraft would not be preserved. They would be consumed. And the A-10 sat at the center of that equation. The pilots understood this better than anyone. Many of them quietly joked that their life expectancy in a full European war would be measured in missions, not years. Some estimates suggested frontline attack squadrons could suffer operational destruction rates exceeding 50% in under 2 weeks if Soviet air defenses remained intact. The numbers became so grim that planners stopped focusing on aircraft longevity entirely. The objective shifted toward maximizing tank kills before inevitable platform loss. That changes the way you see the aircraft, because suddenly the titanium armor no longer looks heroic. It looks desperate. The famous bathtub surrounding the pilot was not evidence of confidence. It was evidence that the designers knew the aircraft would absorb direct fire repeatedly. The armor existed because planners expected the battlefield to become saturated with anti-aircraft fragmentation, heavy machine gun fire, missile debris, and exploding armor columns. The pilot was not protected because survival was guaranteed. The pilot was protected because the system statistically needed him alive long enough to complete another attack run. And the attack run itself was horrifying. To maximize cannon effectiveness, the A-10 often had to fly directly toward enemy armor formations before opening fire. That meant exposing the aircraft head-on to every gun system capable of firing back. During the gun pass, the pilot became trapped inside a tunnel of converging fire where reaction time collapsed into fractions of seconds. Soviet anti-aircraft doctrine specifically trained crews to target aircraft during attack commitment because the pilot's maneuver options became temporarily predictable. In other words, the exact moment the Warthog became most lethal was also the moment it became easiest to kill. That was the hidden trade. And then there was the cannon itself. The GAU-8 Avenger became one of the most psychologically terrifying weapons ever attached to an aircraft. Its sound alone created battlefield panic. But what most people never realize is how absurdly oversized the system actually was. The recoil force generated during sustained firing was so violent that engineers had to center the gun precisely along the aircraft's axis to prevent the jet from destabilizing itself. The ammunition drum consumed enormous internal volume. Entire structural decisions were subordinated to the weapon. The plane was not carrying the cannon. The cannon was carrying the plane. Even more disturbingly, the original tactical logic behind the GAU-8 was rooted in fear that precision-guided weapons would fail under massive wartime conditions. Missiles were expensive. Guidance systems could be jammed. Supply chains could collapse. But depleted uranium rounds fired in massive quantities represented something brutally reliable: industrialized destruction through raw volume. The A-10 embodied Cold War thinking at its purest form. If advanced systems fail, overwhelm the battlefield through mechanical brutality. And that philosophy terrified critics inside the Pentagon. Because by the late 1970s and early 1980s, some strategists believed the aircraft was already becoming obsolete before the war it was designed for had even begun. Radar systems were improving. Surface-to-air missile tracking was accelerating. Thermal targeting was evolving. Critics argued that any aircraft forced to operate visually at low altitude against modern air defenses would eventually face impossible survival odds. But the supporters of the A-10 responded with a terrifying counter-argument. They claimed survival odds no longer mattered. What mattered was battlefield interruption. Even if the aircraft only delayed Soviet armor for a few critical hours, those hours could allow NATO reinforcements to reposition, nuclear escalation decisions to be delayed, or evacuation corridors to remain open. In strategic terms, the Warthog existed to buy time using blood, fuel, and ammunition. And that is when the aircraft stops feeling like a machine. It starts feeling like a sacrificial doctrine. The psychology surrounding the pilots became equally unusual. Unlike high-speed fighter communities that emphasize speed, altitude, and technical superiority, A-10 culture. And nowhere was that rebellion more visible than inside the cockpit itself, because the physical experience of flying the A-10 bordered on psychological warfare against the pilot's own nervous system. Modern fighter aircraft are designed around speed separation. Pilots launch weapons from beyond visual range, disengage rapidly, and minimize exposure windows. The Warthog violated almost every one of those survival principles simultaneously. To identify targets accurately, pilots often had to descend low enough to visually confirm friendly troop positions while navigating smoke, terrain clutter, radio confusion, and overlapping anti-aircraft fire. In a battlefield environment flooded with burning vehicles and electronic interference, the margin for error collapsed into seconds, and once the pilot committed to the attack run, there was no hiding anymore. The aircraft had to fly directly into the battlefield geometry. That geometry is what Cold War planners feared most. The closer the A-10 moved toward enemy armor, the smaller its maneuver envelope became. Every second spent lining up the cannon increased enemy tracking probability. Soviet doctrine understood this perfectly. Anti-air crews were trained not to panic during the first sighting. They waited for the attack vector to stabilize. Then entire defensive networks opened simultaneously. Imagine the psychological pressure of hearing missile warnings while intentionally descending lower. That was the mission profile. And this is the part almost nobody talks about. Many A-10 pilots developed a strange emotional attachment to the danger itself. The aircraft's low-altitude philosophy created a level of battlefield intimacy almost unheard of in jet warfare. Pilots could physically see explosions rippling through armored columns. They could identify individual vehicle silhouettes. They could watch friendly troops signaling from below. The battlefield stopped feeling abstract. It became immediate, personal. Some later described it as feeling less like flying and more like surviving inside a moving firefight. That environment forged a completely different pilot culture. In elite fighter communities, prestige often revolved around speed, technical sophistication, and air superiority. But the Warthog community built its identity around endurance. The aircraft was ugly, slow, vulnerable. Critics mocked it constantly, yet that criticism almost strengthened the loyalty inside the pilot corps. Flying the A-10 became a statement that you were willing to operate where other aircraft could not comfortably remain. And ironically, the aircraft's flaws became central to its mythology. The engines were loud, the targeting systems were outdated, the cockpit visibility was imperfect, the speed was painfully limited, but every weakness forced the pilot closer to the battlefield itself. The aircraft demanded aggression because caution alone could not complete the mission. In a strange way, the Warthog created pilots psychologically adapted to operating inside danger instead of merely avoiding it. Then came one of the most overlooked truths in the aircraft's history. The A-10 was terrifying not only to the enemy, but sometimes to friendly commanders. Because close air support at that level of proximity creates enormous operational risk. One targeting error could kill friendly troops. One delayed communication could collapse an attack window entirely. The aircraft operated in chaotic environments where battlefield information changed by the second. Dust storms, smoke plumes, damaged communications, panicked radio traffic, every variable multiplied uncertainty, and yet commanders kept calling for the Warthog anyway. Because when ground forces became trapped under armored pressure, there were very few systems capable of responding with the same combination of persistence, visual confirmation, and psychological intimidation. The aircraft did not merely attack targets, it imposed presence over the battlefield. Enemy troops knew when it arrived. Friendly troops knew when it stayed. That distinction mattered enormously. Persistence creates morale, and morale changes battlefield behavior. Soldiers fight differently when they believe support is overhead. The terrifying irony is that the aircraft accidentally became most valuable in exactly the kind of warfare strategists originally feared would destroy it. Urban conflict zones, asymmetric warfare, mountain terrain, convoy defense, situations where battlefield identification became more important than pure speed. Again and again, the Warthog survives true strategic predictions of obsolescence because real war refused to behave like clean theoretical simulations. Reality remained messy, human, chaotic, and chaos favored the machine willing to stay close longest. But underneath all the mythology, the numbers never fully disappeared. Pentagon modernization debates repeatedly returned to the same brutal question: how LE